Isaiah chapter 30, verse 1 to 17. Woe to the obstinate nation. Woe to the obstinate children, declares the Lord, to those who carry out plans that are not mine, forming an alliance, but not by my spirit, heaping sin upon sin, who go to Egypt without consulting me, who look for help for Pharaoh's protection, to Egypt's shade for refuge. But Pharaoh's protection will be to your shame. Egypt's shade will bring you disgrace, though they have officials in Zion, and their envoys have arrived in Anes. Everyone will be put to shame because of a people useless to them, who will neither help nor advantage, but only shame and disgrace. A prophecy concerning the animals of Negev. Through a land of hardship and distress, of lions and lionesses, of adders and darting snakes, the envoys carry their riches on donkeys' backs, their treasures on the humps of camels, to that unprofitable nation, to Egypt, whose help is utterly useless. Therefore I call her Rahab the do-nothing. Go now, write it on a tablet for them, inscribe it on a scroll, that for the days to come it may be an everlasting witness. For these rebellious people, deceitful children unwilling to listen to the Lord's instruction, they say to the seers, see no more visions, and to the prophets, give us no more visions of what is right. Tell us pleasant things, prophesy illusions. Leave this way, get off this path, and stop confronting us with the Holy One of Israel. Therefore, this is what the Holy One of Israel says. Because you have rejected this message, relied on oppression, and depended on deceit, this sin will become for you like an eye wall, cracked and bulging, that collapses suddenly in an instant. It will break into pieces like pottery, shattered so mercilessly that among its pieces not a fragment will be found, for taking coals from the earth or scooping water out of a cistern. This is what the sovereign Lord, the Holy One of Israel, says: in repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. But you would have none of it. You said, no, we will flee on horses. Therefore you will flee. You say, we will ride off on swift horses. Therefore your pursuers will be swift. 1,000 will flee at the threat of one. At the threat of 5, you will all flee away, till you are left like a flagstaff on a mountain top, like a banner on a hill.
I'm reading from Isaiah chapter 30, verses 18 to 30. Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. He rises to show you compassion. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. O people of Zion who live in Jerusalem, you will weep no more. How gracious he will be when you cry for help. As soon as he hears, he will answer you. Although the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, your teachers will be hidden no more. With your own eyes you will see them. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." Then you will defile your idols, overlaid with silver, and your images covered with gold. You will throw them away like a menstrual cloth and say to them, "Away with you." He will also send you rain for the seed you grow in the ground, and the food that comes from the land will be rich and plentiful. In that day your cattle will graze in broad meadows. The oxen and donkeys that work the soil will eat fodder and mash spread out with fork and shovel. In the day of great slaughter, when the towers fall, streams of water will flow on every high mountain and every lofty hill. The moon will shine like the sun, and the sunlight will be 7 times brighter, like the sun of 7 full days, when the Lord binds up the bruises of his people and heals the wounds he afflicted. See, the name of the Lord comes from afar, with burning anger and dense clouds of smoke. His lips are full of wrath, and his tongue is a consuming fire. His breath is like a rushing torrent, rising up to the neck. He shakes the nations in the sieve of destruction. He places in the jaws of peoples a bit that leads them astray. And you will sing as on the night you celebrate a holy festival. Your hearts will rejoice as when people go up with flutes to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. The Lord will cause men to hear his majestic voice, and will make them see his arm coming down with raging anger and consuming fire, with cloudburst, thunderstorm, and hail. The voice of the Lord will shatter Assyria. With his scepter he will strike them down. Every stroke the Lord lays on them with his punishing rod will be to the music of tambourines and harps as he fights them in battle with the blows of his arm. Topheth has long been prepared. It's been ready for the king. Its fire pit has been made deep and wide, with an abundance of fire and wood. The breath of the Lord, like a stream of burning sulphur, sets it ablaze. This is the word of the Lord.
So I have a couple of illustrations in my sermon today that are going to test your musical knowledge. So hope you're feeling hot on that subject. The other day, Ninoshka and I, who meet at least once a week to discuss the matters affecting our work, were sitting in a pub for very good reasons for our meeting, and they had music playing over the public address system. So Ninoshka was filling me in on all kinds of information about, I think that's how it worked out anyway, about the songs that were playing. I wonder if you've ever considered why the Bible condemns drunkenness. Any thoughts?
Why? Because we don't make rational decisions when we drink.
Exactly. For the benefit of the recording, as the police sometimes say, Ola said, we don't make rational decisions when we're drunk. You know, the Bible does not at all condemn the drinking of alcohol. And therefore, if you choose not to drink alcohol for any reason, whether it be a matter of taste or addiction or whatever, that is your own business, your own decision. I'm partial to a glass of tequila on a Monday night. I feel spirit of Speedy Gonzales moving within me when arriba. But in the week, I was watching a couple of films that had been recorded many years ago for a musician who was considering releasing a live recording. And these were recorded but never used, and this record company put the idea away. But they have survived. The man who was being recorded was a gentleman called Dean Martin. And as I'm looking around now, I see that most of us are of an age today of knowing that name. Dean Martin, an accomplished actor, a musician and comedian. For many years, part of a successful duo with a man called Jerry Lewis, who they say of the time when they were at their peak, it was the nearest thing that you could find to Beatlemania, in that when they were staying in a hotel in New York, the cars could not move for the crowds that were gathered outside of their hotel window. Now, Dean Martin, in his later career, appeared always, when he was on stage, to be drunk, to be inebriated. And he would be performing with a glass of scotch in his hand. But the amazing thing that struck me as I watched these two performances is that they were almost identical to each other. Now this is something, because if we are right, and the reason that the Lord condemns drunkenness is that we are out of control of ourselves, it is impossible to reproduce exactly something when you are drunk. I'm not recommending you go try it, but it's an interesting thought. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is that it becomes apparent to me that if Dean Martin could fake being drunk, we can fake pretty much anything. And when we were looking at Isaiah 29 last week, from which this passage very much continues, it talked about the way that people sang to the Lord with their lips, but their hearts were far from him. And this is very easy. If faking being drunk is hard, faking how we are in our church meetings, in our worship times, is very easy. Particularly if you are someone who is your habit to come to a church gathering. You know what it looks like, and it is very easy to go through the motions. But I want to say to you, as I did last week, that the Lord is concerned with what is in the heart, not how good a singer you are. Not that you know the words of the songs, not whether you sing loudly or quietly. You know, when I am singing on a Sunday or another day, I sing reasonably well. I sing with a full voice. Most preachers who are friends of mine, you can tell when it's time to sing a worship song because they back away from the microphone, because they know that, particularly if there's going to be a recording, they know they haven't got a good voice. But God doesn't esteem you because you've got a good voice. Those who sang at the coronation a few weeks ago, there were some beautiful singers. But God doesn't think more of them than he thinks of someone who couldn't hit the right key to save their life. It's what's in the heart that matters. We sang that song a moment ago, or a few moments ago, There is a Redeemer. And it was written by a lady called Melody Green. And Melody Green was married to a gentleman called Keith Green, who was a gospel and Christian singer in the 1980s. Unfortunately, he and his young children died in a plane crash as a very sad occasion. And during his recording career, he became aware that when he performed to a secular audience, there were many people in the audience who were responding to his songs that contained the message of the gospel. But when he performed to a Christian audience, there was lots of applause and lots of people just going through the motions. And so he decided to record a new album, and he called it So You Wanna Go Back to Egypt, targeting his Christian audience with the idea that they'd rather be back in the days before they belonged to God, and recalling the story of Jacob and Joseph and their family. And he thought, I have to find a way to make this record be a broad audience record. Lots of people buy it. So he called up his friend Bob Dylan. And the one thing you might know about Bob Dylan is that some people will buy something because it's got Bob Dylan on, regardless of what it is. And he said to Bob, will you come and play a harmonica solo on this record? And so Bob came, played his harmonica solo. And there are still people who are hunting down this record 40 years later because it's got Bob Dylan playing a harmonica solo on it. Trust me, I know about these things. And then when it still didn't sell as much as he wanted to, and he wasn't here concerned about money, he decided that if you came to his concert, you would get a free copy and you would take it home and say it was So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. And it was largely based upon this chapter, the title that is, in that the story here is of God's people who go down to Egypt without consulting me, who look to help for Pharaoh's protection, to Egypt's shade for refuge. Now God had set the people of Israel free from slavery. Sometimes we look at those events in the book of Exodus and we say, how could a loving God do this? How could he kill the firstborn children of the Egyptians? And the answer was that he had promised Moses that he would set the people of Israel free from their slavery. You know, we have a song, go down, Moses, go down to Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. And so now in the days of Isaiah, people, rather than turn to God for help, were turning to Pharaoh for help. And it wasn't that they'd asked God and he said to them, go back to Egypt where there is more provision to be had. They didn't consult with God at all. Their prayers were just whispers, you know. When you're a child, if you're fortunate enough to be brought up in a house where there is prayer, prayer is a good thing, but sometimes it can become a very routine thing. Perhaps you kneel at the foot of your bed, like Christopher Robin, if you get that reference, and you say, God bless Mummy, God bless Daddy, God bless Auntie Jenny, God bless Linus, God bless Isabel, Amen. Which is great, but on the 30th time you've said it, then I doubt it's coming from the heart. And not only were these people going back to Egypt, the home of their former slavery, but they were saying to those that God had sent, the seers and the prophets, see no more visions. Give us no more visions of what is right. We don't want to know what you want from us, God. And we'll keep going through the routine of worship, because frankly you can fake anything. Dean Martin taught me that lesson. But God wants us to turn around and be determined to serve him before the day of judgment. And so I want to ask you today, what is important to you? What is important to you when you are going to work? What is important to you when you are in the supermarket? What is important to you when you come to this building? We know that people can come to a building of religion and worship and abuse it. Jesus' life tells us this. You know, there are those who think that the stories in the Gospels come in a random order, and that the Gospel writers place them in order to develop a theme. I can't disprove that, but I think it is better to understand that where there is a change of order in the Bible, it is because Jesus did things more than once. So, for example, there is in one gospel a Sermon on the Mount, and another gospel a Sermon on the Plain. And people will say, well, which one was it? Somebody once said to me, well, you know, the Bible's riddled with mistakes. There's one instance where Jesus miraculously feeds the 5,000, and there's another instance where Jesus miraculously feeds the 4,000. I had to point out that both of those events are in the same book, and therefore they are not contradictions. Wandering teachers tell the same story many times. I once had dinner with a man called Tony Campolo, who was a noted Christian preacher. If you're old enough to remember Dean Martin, then perhaps you're old enough to remember a television program called Sergeant Bilko. And Tony Campolo was the spitting image of Phil Silvers, who played Sergeant Bilko. And I was eating dinner with him at Spurgeon's College many years ago, and you began to realize that this marvelous preacher who toured the world teaching the gospel had got maybe 5 sermons, and he repeated them over and over again. And one of the reasons that he was a great preacher was that every time he preached, it fine-tuned the story, because he got to understand the bits that the audience responded to. But what I'm going with this is that in the gospel, there is one occasion at the beginning of his ministry where Jesus is said to have cleansed the temple. And there is one occasion at the end of his ministry where Jesus is said to have cleansed the temple. Now, either we conclude that the order of these things is different for emphasis, or you end up where I am in thinking that Jesus sent out a message that the temple worship was wrong at the beginning of what he was doing, and at the end of what he was doing just before the crucifixion. So we know that places of religion are prone to complacency, and the lives of Christian people are prone to taking things for granted. Take, for example, Christians who help the homeless. I think we do pretty good on this in our church. But sometimes we conclude, well, that man who is begging for money is obviously fake, and therefore I will give no money to help the homeless. The other day, Isabel and I were in a car and we're travelling through the centre of London, and there was a man with a sign who was begging at the side of the street, and Isabel said to me, at least he's honest. Was his sign said, collecting for whiskey and vodka. And you couldn't make it up, could you really? But do remember that it is our responsibility to care for the poor. If you think it's the council's responsibility, then great. Next time there are local elections, elect different officials. But the church has to stand in the gap. We have to do right. It is our responsibility to show love to people. Imagine, for example, if you were dealing with somebody and you have to ring up a company because you've got a bill that you think is wrong. I had this a few weeks ago with my energy supplier. I was paying an extortionate amount of money to them every month, and my bills meant that the accumulation of money in my account was ridiculous, and then you have to contact them to get a refund, and you find out it's just not going anywhere. But imagine if you were working for that company, and on that particular day you had 10 people ring up and have a rant and a rave at you. Do you want to be the 11th person? Or do you want to treat somebody like a human being? I think the latter is the Christian response. We cannot be going through the motions. Now, the reason that this is so relevant is that chapter 29 and chapter 30 of Isaiah are condemnations of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the house of God, the place where people even today say, I'm going to travel to Jerusalem because I want to see what happened there. I know what happened there. Jesus turned some tables over, knocked some money about, and set some animals free. And then when they wanted to crucify him, they just took him outside of the city. You know, it's funny, we sing that hymn mostly at Easter time. There is a green hill far away without a city wall. Used to puzzle me when I sang that as a kid. First of all, because I didn't know any cities other than York that had a city wall. But secondly, I didn't really understand the significance. And without, in that context, doesn't mean it didn't have a city wall. It means outside the city wall. Because the people of Jerusalem knew that they were going to do something offensive to God. And therefore they were going to shift it so it didn't affect the place of God's presence. God is everywhere. And so the message here is very much that within Jerusalem in Isaiah's day, there were those who were faithful and those who were not. Verse 19, people of Zion who live in Jerusalem, you will weep no more. It's not everybody in Jerusalem that will experience God's blessing. It is the people of Zion. And again, here you have to understand that Zion is not a political term like it is sometimes used in the modern era. It is the image of the hill of the Lord, the mountain of the Lord, where the people of God will gather. If you like, an image of the new Jerusalem. A very great man of the church who lived in Africa in the 4th century, a man called Augustine of Hippo, developed an idea that said, in our meetings, there is the visible church and the invisible church. There are those who appear to belong to God, but the ones that God is really in touch with are those who truly belong to God. It's an idea that you would do well to understand. People speak of Britain, United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland as being Christian nations. And they look at the result of the census of 2021 and they say, isn't it appalling that the amount of people in the country who are identifying as Christians is falling? Well, no, I think it's just that some people have woken up and they're being honest with their lives. Because there was a time where it was the social thing to do to come to church on a Sunday. We have a small congregation today, and I don't take any pleasure in the fact that we have not many people who have decided to come to church today. But also, at the same time, it is better to look at what you believe. Consider your life. Be honest with yourself and honest with God. There was a bishop who wrote a very alarming book in the 1960s called Honest with God, where he wrote down all the doubts he had. It was a bestseller, but it was so controversial. because we're not used to people voicing their doubts about belief. And so we need to get ourselves sorted out. And if we do, on the day of God bringing us great reward, we're told in verse 21, whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. Now that's wonderful, you know. People say, well, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that's very true. But as I wander through my life, I've met many Jesuses. There's the Jesus of the cults. There's the Jesus of the Muslims. There is the Jesus of the Pentecostals and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Church of England, the Liberal Church of England and the Conservative Church of England. I don't mean politics then either. But how wonderful, not only to know that Jesus is the way, but to hear the voice of God in our hearts saying, this is the way that Jesus would take. Walk in it. It's a marvelous idea. Because the other thing that you find in chapters 29 and 30 is if you ask a Christian about how they know that God is speaking to them, they say, well, I have a still small voice within me. God's voice of judgment in chapters 29 and 30 is not still and it is not small. It is loud and it is angry and it brings in the end of the world. So we need to take some time to be attentive to God, and if we are attentive to God, then He will be attentive to us. And when He is attentive to us, we are told that we will weep no more. And that resonates with the message of the book of Revelation. When we come to that new Jerusalem, to that holy Zion, to that place of heaven, you know, the place that we don't currently see, we're told that there will be no more tears, no more grief, no more mourning, because God will have made everything good, just as it was in the beginning. Amen.